privilege of introducing today's webinar. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for ICTs, and we are also the organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit, alongside the X Prize Foundation, 36 UN sister agencies, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of this summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale the solutions for global impact. The AI Summit has gone digital this year with weekly online programming, allowing us to reach even more people all throughout 2020. We are very pleased today to host this webinar with AI for Africa on Cosmo-Ubuntu, machine learning and cognitive code switching. We have a distinguished set of panelists today, but like always, we are counting on you, the participants, to help really make this an engaging discussion. For this, we will be using the Q&A functionality, which you can find just left of center at the bottom of your screen, and we will also be using the chat functionality. When you're using the chat, please make sure to set the message recipients to all participants and panelists, not just all panelists. That way we can make sure, and you can make sure that everyone can see your message. Now, before we turn to our panel, I would like to ask everyone to try out the chat functionality and let us know where you're connecting from, which country or which city. So I will begin. I will open up the chat, set my message recipients to all panelists and attendees, and write Geneva, Switzerland. And then, okay, we have Jamaica. Make sure to send to all panelists and attendees. I see lots of just panelist entries. We have Kenya, Florida, Argentina, another one from Kenya, Philadelphia, Brazil. So we have people from all around the world, which is very exciting. So without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce today's facilitator, Dr. S. Emma Ray, who is an associate professor of dance at the University of California, Irvine, and a co-founder of AI for Africa. So over to you, S. Emma.
Thank you, Ada, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name's S. Emma Ray, and I'm here in California today, and I'm delighted to finally be here. We are a group of people that are spread across Africa and the diaspora. And I'm just going to share with you a little bit of backstory that brings us here today to this panel on Cosmo-Ubuntu, machine translation and cognitive code switching. Before I do that, I do have some important thank yous to make. And the first would be to Amir Banafatemi, without whom none of this would have occurred. Amir is one of the people who is part of intrinsic to the X Prize, who work with ITU to deliver this annual conference in Geneva. Amir had invited me to the conference in 2019. I'd also like to thank Chris Akiwumi, without whom, again, none of this would have happened. Chris and I met at the conference in 2019, and it was really the combination of both of our energies and insight that led us towards building this coalition and this initiative. So greatest thanks, Chris. And I believe you're in London now. Chris Akiwumi was formerly the head of regulatory affairs for Microsoft across Africa and the Middle East. And I had the pleasure of meeting him at the conference. So conferences have many purposes. Meeting people is one of those. Today, I hope you'll get to meet each other as well as us. And so I'd just like to bring up the very first slide that shows a little bit about our vision for AI for Africa. And we are many people. And again, before I go further, I really do need to thank Ada and Reinhold at ITU, who have really shepherded us through this process. And we've had many calls and many emails and many conversations to facilitate today. So thank you very much. So we're a team that, as I said, come from all across the world. And we were due to be in Geneva presenting multiple panels convened by ITU. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of the background of my experience in 2019 that was part of really extending my energy, my vigor into building this coalition. So if you would just share the next video. So, 2019
Like last year, participants concentrated on AI-orientated solutions, but overall, there was a focus on data and AI becoming a shared resource if everyone is really serious about turning this into a force for good. Inclusion and diversity were really crucial themes throughout the week, and one way of highlighting that was by reaching out to and learning from the creative fields.
There are lots of innovations that are happening in all fields, including the arts. So being a contributor here, but also being educated here is also very important to me.
AI is right now the catchphrase where everybody's trying to attach himself to it, and we have to examine it really carefully, and I think art helps us to do this. It calibrates our perception.
We are all in it together. Every government, company, university, international institution, civil society organization, and every single one of us should consider how best to work together to ensure AI serves as a positive force for humanity.
So that's it from us at the AI for Good Global Summit 2019. More than 2,000 people participated this year in what has become the world's leading platform to discuss the practical applications of artificial intelligence, not just in the fields of science and technology, but also in health, education, and the arts.
There you have it. And so you'll see that we are a group of people that come from very many different fields, and we're also intergenerational. The youngest amongst us is Mustafa Diawal Haq. He is a very, very forward-thinking engineer in Ghana. He's currently the recipient of the Zaid Prize for Innovation in the field of food and technology. And we also have medical doctors, and we have filmmakers and visual artists. We are storytellers, we are choreographers, we are data scientists, of course. And we care deeply about Africa and the diaspora and facilitating the trajectory of these technologies being used to raise the life chances of the least among us. And so this really coalesces with AI for Good's mission concerning the SDGs and those 17 missions that we are addressing globally. And so at this point, I will move us into the heart of the presentation. And today we have 3 panelists, and we are inspired by the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who happens to be a colleague of mine here at UC Irvine. We're focusing on machine translation and the possibility of this engagement of African peoples all over the world being able to remember their mother tongue, starting, of course, with the possibility of collapsing those artificial borders between countries that were colonized and then became adoptees of European languages. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his mission has been centrally focused on creating from his own mother tongue of Kikungu. And in speaking with him via text message the other day, he isn't able to make it this morning, but he said anything that helps us is most welcome. And so in the spirit of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's mission, we continue this through the digital world. And so we are now inspired to continue and very much stimulated by the group we are amongst. So I know you're out there focused and participating, other people as part of this group. So I'll quickly mention Ash Bacchus-Clark, Alexis Convento. I know you're there, as is Andre Zachary and also Thomas de France. So we are multi-generational, we're geo-dispersed, but we've been working on this digital, dispersed, flattened terrain since September last year. So we are not a listserv. We are very actively engaged and we're growing. And we do hope that today you're stimulated and to the point where you'd like to lean in and engage with the forward motion that we are launching. And so thank you once again to ITU for giving us this opportunity. And we hope to come back with further panels. Without further ado, handing over to our first panelist, Dr. Jose Cossa. He's from Mozambique, and he's also an associate professor in the College of Education at Pennsylvania State University. Over to you, Jose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the wonderful introduction to this session. And thank you for the invitation to actually be a part of this panel, ITU and everyone that has an ADA for putting this together, helping us put this together. And, Reinhard and the team. And I would like to also thank everybody who actually came here to engage in this conversation, because it is a very critical conversation, since we find ourselves at a crossroads of sorts. And many times, part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation is that many times Africa and Black people, so to speak, in general, throughout the world, have actually been left out of such conversations. And we thought that bringing this wide population, group of people, this great population that has contributed to the development of the world onto the table would be critical. But not just bringing bodies on, but also bringing our cosmology, bringing our epistemologies, our way of thinking, our way of doing things, and so on, kind of really just tackling that. So if, would you come to go to the slide, please? The first slide. Next slide. So, the one thing that I want to point out is that many times when we talk about AI, we talk about technology, we often separate the human from the technology, and we assume that whatever is produced in the technological world is simply going to be a tool to assist human beings for efficiency and so on and so on. What we don't, we neglect or sometimes don't really want to address is the fact that whoever created this is a human being. So the human element still plays a big part in the creation of that. And if you think about creationism, for those of you who believe in creationism, this idea that God breathed life into the human and created the human in its own likeness, right? So when we talk about AI, it's really human intelligence that powers machines with its intelligence. And it's almost like breathing life into these machines. And these machines then become an image, really, intellectual images of the human. And so whatever they will do things the way we have informed them to do. And so in a sense, we are gods in that space. Machines don't create themselves, we create them and we breathe our lives into them, in the form of intellectualism. So I want to address this specifically because our perception of human then becomes incredibly important in this space, how we perceive the human. And in this space, normally people will will be addressing the human in a very humanistic, modernistic sense. Cogito ergo sum, the Cartesian, idea, I think, therefore I am, this realization that humans realize their existence through the mind, through this intellect. And so in that space, your perception of being then begins to shape the space in the machine, the technological space. And so the machine's intelligence is also going to be informed by that particular dualism of, the Cartesian dualism of sorts. And when you understand yourself in terms of the mind, then there is this, and the intellect, then the question becomes whose intelligence is really being fed into the machine. And with the human intelligence, the perception of human being, I think, therefore I am, then you are informing that machine with that particular perception. And then what it does is, and we've seen some of these examples, is that machine carries also your bias, it carries your perception of the world, and it carries your perception of people outside of your own community. And so we have had issues of, machines not recognizing, Black people or women and things of that sort. And so that's because this is the perception of human we have, and the machines then gain that particular perception. And we can elaborate more on this later, but let's move on to the next slide, please. So we want to present a different understanding of human here, which is really a way of looking back and drawing from our past while informing the present and moving forward. Now, in African time, there is really no past, present, and future in the same way of the linear way that the modernity kind of world and Western world looks at it. So the song of a bird is a really good representation of that, because sun talks about returning and call to go, and to look, seek. So sankofa is really to go back to find the information that we have actually either misplaced, lost, or has been denied us, and go back to this ancestral wisdom and bring it with us. And so the little egg you see on the bird is this hope for the future, that there is, we are carrying this wisdom with us to the future. And since we are in a very technological kind of a cross lines, AI being one of the new, kids on the block, we need to address this. We need to bring this sort of wisdom onto to the stage. And so since we address the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am being the dominant perception of the human that really informs a lot of our technology and so on, and has caused a lot of issues, precisely because it doesn't really include those other cosmologies and epistemologies outside of modernity. So then we want to bring on, shine some light onto Ubuntu. So Ubuntu means literally, the motto is, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person through, unto, because, and some say with other persons. And that is a perception, almost like whenever you're looking at fellow human beings, you're looking at this person, this individual that you call self. And so this is different from, I think, therefore I am, the realization of existence through the mind. So when you think of communities, you think of human in that particular sense, then you're going to be able to inform machines and technology in that same way. And in this perception, as we will see later, we'll talk about it later, is that all humans really are Bantu. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So, because personhood is not, in this sense, it's not an imposed universalism. So what happened is, if you look at that map, this is Vasco da Gama's, the Portuguese, explorer, just trying to find his way to India, and comes to Southern Africa. And the story goes that, part of the explorer's trajectory was to go to India, but they ended up in the so-called Southern African area. And so they, encounter people there, and they ask them, so who are you? And the answer is Bantu. And Bantu, the answer really was people. We are people, like you are people. And so the European, with the Cartesian dualism, with the cogito ergo sum, sort of realization, and the three, tenets of modernity that it carried, which is this personal individuation, the cultural rationalization, and the structural differentiation, the hierarchies that are embedded in that. They said, oh, so you are the Bantu people. And when you look at history books and everything that has been written since then, is the people of that region alone were considered Bantu. But what that particular perception was of human was, we are human as you are human. So move on to the next slide, please. So there's no sense of, the imposed universalism in that context. There's no sense of exclusionary, there's no better humans and then the other humans. We are all human in the same way. So if you think of that in terms of informing machines about that through that sort of understanding of human, then you would have less of an issue with differentiation, that these machines would be informed with the ability of viewing humans in the same way everywhere, because we are human. And so you would have less of racist, issues and gender differentiation and ethnic sorts of issues. So we need to begin to embed this in the conversations very early, because what has happened really is historically is that, through modernity and modernization cycle, what I call a modernization cycle is that you have invention. You come through the cogito ergo sum idea, you inventing, and you inventing in the sense that the individual is inventing this. And the individual is inventing this because the individual has their own personal individual kinds of interests. And so because they're also living in a cultural differentiation of sorts, they also see elitism there as an important component, that we have to be different. Definitely, we can rationalize the reason machines are going to, or our inventions are not going to serve all peoples. They're going to serve some people better than others, of course, because we are different people, right? And so it's okay to do that. This was the rationale of colonialism too, the cultural differentiation, that the rationalization of culture, and so then creating the structures around it and saying, yes, we can differentiate structures because we need to sustain, all structures have to work together so they complement, so that they can, we can have this. And so all of that stuff is just really, it's part of this, it really springs from that very foundation of cogito ergo sum. And it has been, fed into this modernization cycle of we invent, from that perception without thinking about the human from the Ubuntu perception of sorts. And so we're thinking only in the way of the humanist, Western humanism sort of thing, which is the individual and so on. And so we invent, and whatever we invent is okay. It can do harm to other people because those are other. It is us versus they, Cartesian dualism, so we can damage the earth, the planet, and other, because those things are not really a part of who we are. We are separate from that. And so going to Africa and dumping, all sorts of toxics was okay. Colonizing peoples was okay. So we can create machines to help us do that, and without regarding necessarily what's, totally disregarding what's happening on the continent and so on. So, and we continue to see this cycle, and then we move on to remediation, which is this part of, now the ethics conversation. Now we have to begin to develop some sort of ethics so that they can guide us, through this. And this ethical argument is still built within that very same modernistic standpoint. It's not outside of it. So the ethics are simply remediation of all those things, and they're very much incommensurate with Ubuntu. They don't match, and so the ones who didn't participate in this whole conversation, they can participate in the ethics conversation, because that's a whole different framework. And then we move on to complacency, because we've done our part, and now we feel good about ourselves, and let's move on to the next thing. And so the savior mentality and so on, those are things that really exist that continue to propagate. Next slide, please. So, so the thing we really wanting to draw here is that Africa has to participate global Africa. And we're talking about, Black people everywhere, Africans everywhere, diaspora and on the continent, that we have to participate in the process of conceptualizing, inventing, innovating, and operating. What we have been doing so far, and I've worked with NSF projects here in the United States, and one of the things that I really felt, was really painful to see many times was how much the young Black students in CS were really participating more in on the part of the usage of the technology to advance other things, not on the crafting of the actual technology, the birthing of these things and the conceptualizing part. Why? Because of how the colonization process operates. And so it constantly pushes certain people, the other, to either the so-called margins or what I call the exterior to modernity. And so we need to get on this. We're not to be included. I'm not arguing for inclusion here because I really don't want to be included in the project of modernity, but I'm talking about breaking down these borders that exist and beginning to have, what I call debordering and deperipherizing and so on, beginning to have conversations across the board in a very equitable way. So we need to bring this because this cosmology really embraces something beyond just human beings, but also the non-human world and all the cosmos and so on. And that's why the reason this is called Cosmo-Ubuntu is because when the Africans said Bantu, they were not saying this is an African thing, that this is a definition of human for Africans only. This is for the world, so there's no othering. We all are human. We all are Bantu. So it is a Cosmo-Ubuntu instead. Next slide, please. And as you saw in the previous slide, the kid with a toy that was creating this wire car thing. It kind of brings memories of my own childhood when we did wire cars, and we created our own toys, and we were developers at a very early stage until we got into school, and school pretty much began to teach us other things, and completely disregarded the experience and the intellectual engagement that little kids have in Africa. And we have a lot of creative flow. And so why is it that we are not more and more in this part, of the conversation? So what we really need to do, humans must do, is to assure that AI conceptualization and advances are found on this Ubuntu-infused justice. And the Cosmo-Ubuntu theorizing and praxis really, because there's a lot of theoretical grounding of the stuff that we do in Africa, but it's never considered theoretical. We're not considered theoreticians, because we have to be, we have to borrow some sort of critical theories from elsewhere to interpret our own reality. But I want us to begin to think about this more seriously, and also to avoid the perils of past innovations, which have hurt us so much and Black people profusely. So I believe that's the last slide. Thank you very much for the time.
Great. Thank you, Jose. Each time we meet and each time we talk about these concepts, it affirms what it is that we're doing and the way in which our group works in a very circular and leaning in and leaning on way, as opposed to a hierarchical structure. But I also want to talk a little bit about innovation. So you talk about often we're looked upon as consumers, as those that use what the West has created. But I want to trouble that a little bit. So as we know, in the West now we have mobile banking. And many of you may not know, the mobile banking really got its grip and its sophistication in Africa and India. And this was the place where they disrupted the uses of the technology and started to do things that were novel and innovative. I think about other ways in which we may have used Western instruments, thinking about jazz music. We took a saxophone and we created something completely else. So this perception that we're behind in terms of technology, would you like to speak to that just briefly?
Yes. So I mean, Cosmo-Ubuntu really does. It's this. If you perceive Cosmo-Ubuntu in this, in the sense of the human being Bantu, we all Bantu. So there's no, without hierarchies, without borders, and so on. The way we look at the world is exactly that. That we can actually interact with the world without losing, this sense of humanity. We can interact with fellows everywhere without necessarily losing the core of our humanity. So learning an instrument from elsewhere, a language, like if you look at African communities, we speak, like in Mozambique, we have about 16 nations or so, right? Which are called tribes by the colonial powers. And I don't like that term, it's a colonial word. So we have actual nations there, right? And South Africa too. So and other various parts of Africa, and we speak different national languages. So we don't necessarily, I mean, the fact that I'm Shangaan and Ronga doesn't mean that speaking Zulu makes me lose my identity as Shangaan and Ronga, or that part of my identity as Shangaan and Ronga, right? But I can speak Zulu. I can learn instruments from folk in West Africa and play those instruments, and I can learn the guitar from elsewhere and use that for humanity's sake. It is not for the sake of a specific group. So this whole idea of dividing and having this so if we're not a part of the creation of stuff, it becomes very problematic. So if we can't name things, it becomes also an issue. So in AI it's really new, and we all trying to find a way around this. And this is the time when we can all be thinking, what is the intelligence in it, right, that goes into it? So we're not necessarily thinking in terms of, who develops the robot, who develops the phone, who develops that, but it's what's the intelligence that goes into that. And that intelligence carries a cosmology, carries all sorts of things and cultures and so on. And this is how we should be thinking about AI if we want to serve humanity.
And I believe there are things yet to be revealed about what these technologies can do. And one of the people that's at the vanguard of discovery is our next speaker. And leading on for this topic of language, which is central, is Dr. Vukosi Marivate. He's the ABSU Chair of Data Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Vukosi comes to us through our network, which extended through reaching and looking to make a very diverse and inclusive conversation. So as we reached out to him in December, he responded vigorously and said, okay, what's happening? And he's been a vigorous part of this community. So I'm going to hand over to you, Vukosi, to really give us this interior of the research that you've been doing with Masakhane and translation.
Right. Greetings, everyone. And hello, from South Africa. I'm Vukosi Marivate. We can load up the slides. Okay. I'm Vukosi Marivate, and I'm the ABSA UP Chair of Data Science and in the Computer Science Department at the University of Pretoria. I lead a research group called Data Science for Social Impact. And today, really, I want to talk through a journey of what brought us to Masakhane, which is a project that I'm one of the chief investigators on there. And just for trivia, I myself also am Tsonga, so I am connected in some ways to Jose in Mozambique. As per such, my father is Tsonga and my family in terms of my paternal side on that part. Next slide, please. So normally when I give these talks, let's actually set up some of the basics so that we can actually understand each other. We talk about things, but we don't really understand some of the kind of foundations that allow us to really engage. So one of the things with emerging technologies is that text and language is a very rich interface to share information and also interact with machines. But there are some questions that we have to ask ourselves as we do this, is like, how do machines process language information? And also then, why is local language important, right? Not just for the sake of it. As per such. Next slide. So to do this, first we need to understand kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing. So artificial intelligence is at its basics defined as you have a machine. It's as a concept. It lives in an environment. It can perceive things in the environment. it can perform actions, and then it can reach a goal. So if we think about a search engine such as Google or Bing as an AI, it's a machine, it lives in an environment, it lives on the internet, it can perceive it, it can read web pages as it's crawling it, it can perform actions. So when you type in a query, what it does is that it searches through its databases, and the goal is to return a result that is actually connected to the query that you put in. Sometimes we tend to think about this from a robot or robotics, where you have a machine being the robot. It lives in an environment. Let's say it's in your house. It's a vacuum cleaning robot. It can perform actions. It can move around, and then from moving around, it then can clean. And the goal is to keep your house clean. Machine learning is a subset of AI, where we now want to say, hey, how then, to do these intelligent actions, how can we then learn in patterns then from data? So we get, so if you think about spam, what you do is that you always click, if you see spam in your email, and you give it a label to say, oh, this email is actually spam. And if you give the machine enough data, what it does is that it can learn patterns that emails like this are okay, they're ham, and emails like this are likely going to be spam. Now, natural language processing then is how then do we deal with textual data, right? On that part, how do we process it? And this can have different tasks. So whether it can be translation, it can be things like spam detection, it can be chatbots where you're talking to these machines online. Next slide. Right, but then we hit this wall, right? That if we look at the internet as it is, we've gotten used to interacting with the internet in English. And is it then this equalizing force that we think it is? So the reasons, though, that we don't have a lot of these machines or these language tools, whether it's translation or talking to your virtual assistants or a Google Assistant in your local languages, is this lack of sufficient language resources. So if I look at South Africa, for example, we have of our top newspapers, most of them are in English. We have 11 official languages, English and Afrikaans, two of them. And then there's the other one. As I said, I speak Xitsonga and I also speak Setswana in a way. But if you look at the top 10 newspapers in the country by circulation, you'll see most of them are in English. There's some in isiZulu, and then it tapers off. Right? So there's then inequality in data availability. So an example that we can actually then look at kind of data availability is, let's look at Wikipedia. Again, we think of Wikipedia as this equalizing force that's open to everybody. But then if you then started thinking, how many Wikipedia articles are written in a specific language? English is over 6 million articles right now. And in South Africa, that's only 10%. People who speak English as a first language. Afrikaans has about 90,000, and it's only 13% of people who speak that language. If you go down to isiZulu, it only has 1,400 articles actually written in isiZulu, but that's 23% of the country actually speaks, or talks first language isiZulu. So this is very interesting that now that data is not available, right? And it's also now rare to find these annotated data sets for these different tasks publicly. So how then can we actually think about ways to innovate, to do data collection, or to build up things like doing translation for these other languages? Next slide. Right, and this then brings us to really thinking about why it's so important for indigenous language, right? If we don't really do this, we don't think about how the internet, how machines, how AI develops with our local languages, is that we then are going to then miss things that we could be capturing. So languages capture things like culture. They capture indigenous knowledge, and knowledge systems. And if we are really getting to the point now where if a language is not understood by a machine, a couple of years from now, it's almost like it's going to be that language never existed. And with it then goes those indigenous knowledge. There goes those cultures that then kind of disappear because we're moving into this monolingualism. How did we get here? We do have inequality of language. I did show the kind of how we then have low resource languages. We also have colonial legacies that I think also touching on what Jose had been talking about. In a lot of African countries, the only kind of major reasons that languages were actually in some way gotten to be developed was in the service of colonialism, where you're going back to, oh, let's actually do some translation or learn a specific local language so that we can actually interact with the locals, but then not really to benefit them, but then for us to understand on there. And there's also kind of intertwined with missionaries coming to Africa and also doing the translations to translate the Bible and then spread more religion than again developing and working with the local populations, right? And when then we're moving to this more move of monolingualism online, there's lack of data, and then there's the whole question of who actually develops these systems that we're actually using on that part. Next slide. Right? And it's very important when we think about the data, because for any machine learning kind of system, you need to give it training data so that you can build a model. And then this model is the thing that you use. So even if you're using things like Google Translate or Amazon Translate, they have been given loads of initial data, and then you push it through into an algorithm, it pops out a model, and then you can use that service. But there is that question, where is this data? Next slide, please. Right? And to do that, we need to then have a framework to kind of look at this. And one is that there are, Africa has some of the most, the biggest linguistic diversity in terms of languages, but there's low availability of data when it comes to those languages. It's very hard to discover, sometimes to find language resources in order to use to build these AI systems. Also, there's challenges of focus. So if most of kind of the tech world, the academic world is looking at English as the things that they're developing for, it's very hard then if you're a young researcher then to think, oh, I should actually be focusing on more local languages. And there's also very few benchmarks or ways to reproduce these benchmarks. Next slide. Right? And this is where Masakhane comes in, and it builds also on this concept of Ubuntu, that a person is a person because of others. Masakhane means let's actually build each other in isiZulu. And it's a research effort which started initially with doing machine translation, so going from one language to another across the African continent. This project is open source, so everything that's done through the project actually is open. People collect data and they make it all available openly. People build these machine learning or AI models, and they also make them available. It's continent-wide, it's distributed, and it's online. So we kind of break the physical borders. People work together on specific projects, and they work on lots of different languages to actually figure out how to get data. And data in this case is these things called parallel corpora, where you have two documents parallel to each other that are in two languages, but they're actually synced. So one sentence actually connects to the other one. And then this is what you would feed in to a neural machine translation system. The people who are on kind of at the moment on this project, there's a big contingent from Southern Africa, but then you can see on the map there across the whole African continent, you have people who are all the way from secondary school up to PhD, who in terms of who is there in terms of the highest level of education and their occupation. You have linguists, software engineers, people like current data scientists, researchers, and even current students that are on there, because the project is in this way where you can go and see how people are building these things and then be able to easily join. Next slide. Right. The reach at the moment is massive. We've had over 144 participants in this project, from 17 African countries, and they come, as I said, from this diverse background. And it's very important for that. If these systems then are being built for Africans by Africans, they also then are going to bring in that care to understand what specific challenges actually mean and how to get over them. We've had people spending weekends with people in the community who are then writing down folk tales in their language or translating them and then making these available. As again, I said, you're capturing these indigenous knowledge, you're capturing these concepts of culture that then we build into these AI kind of systems. And as of February 2020, we now had over 35 translation results for over 29 different African languages, right? And then these are loads of contributors who are making this available online on these repositories. So you can go to the masakhane.io website to go see what's actually going in the project. And now there's a second part of the project. As I said, the initial focus was on machine translation, so being able to translate from one language to another and having a system that's available. Hopefully by the end of the year, you'll be able to go test out and then put in loads of different African languages and then be able to translate from one language to another to see this. This is something that you don't even have currently on the major platforms like Google or Microsoft on there. Next slide. The outputs here are the technologies, but then there's also a critical engagement in the scholarship. And the reach that is out there, if we look at it this way, is that we can now see how people are publishing and they're starting to now write their experiences and of their work, and where now we had multiple submissions to one of the workshops at like one of the eminent AI conferences in the world, which is ICLR 2020, and you can see how many papers were there from the Masakhane community, right? It's not one person, it's not one lab in one country, but it's all these distributed people who are continuing to now play an active role in these different. So even this week at the ICML conference, which is another top tier machine learning conference, there's also a lot of reach by people from the Masakhane community. Next slide. Right. So how do we move forward? We need to get people to understand, and that's one of the reasons I really joined in onto this project. And then also, I'm very happy to speak at this webinar for people to understand what actually means, to have an active AI community on the African continent that's building tools that is directed to Africans. We need to collate and annotate data, and you can always reach out to the Masakhane community and see ways that you can also donate data that you might have. And we also need to expand practice and skill in the community. So people in the Masakhane project, they work together, they build skill together. We also have the Deep Learning Indaba, which is the largest grassroots machine learning or AI program in the world that was actually built on the African continent. And these kind of different systems like Data Science Africa, Data Science Nigeria, they're all working together and interfacing with each other to build this community. Next slide, which I think should be my last slide. Right. So thank you for the time this evening. I really look forward to engaging also with the questions and trying to answer some of them. But there is a lot that is going on. And yeah, if you do want to get in touch, there are my contact details. So thank you.
Great, fantastic. It's so fascinating. And the ways that this can ripple out into the diaspora are also enormous, since we have also created new languages in the Caribbean and in South America, these hybrids, which people would like to call pidgin, but in fact they do have their own grammatical indexical structures that can denote them as languages. But I'm going to speak to the possibility, the dream of the farmer in Rwanda, or the Farmers Association in Rwanda, and the Farmers Association in Kenya, in this critical moment where there is need for direct innovation and sharing of information that can ultimately save lives. How do you see this technology being used in such critical situations, given the fact that we are about advancing this space for those that have the need at the critical moment? How do we get this information and the tool to the point where it can translate to two different communities working remotely without a middle person that is translating into a European language? What does that look like?
Sure. Thanks actually for bringing that up, and we didn't rehearse this one. So in any way, because if you look at Kinyarwanda as a language, and then also look at Kiswahili, anyway, there's been now a move to, I primarily work in text, so that's why I gave these examples that are textual based, but then you can also think about speech. There's a big project that's been going on for Mozilla on the African continent also to record people speaking in Kinyarwanda and then also in Kiswahili, and then making these data available for machine learning and AI researchers to actually work on and then build on that. You can actually do these translations. I have a student who's working on another language specifically to do live translation where you go from speech to text and then translate it and on live as you're watching a video. And it's very important, I guess, like again, to highlight this, because once these tools become available and these resources become available, we do open up these resources that we say are coming from the internet for more people to be able to engage with. They can then engage with very their information, their data, their knowledge in a specific area. If you're thinking about the mountains of Rwanda or the hills of Rwanda and saying, here, I'm a farmer, I work on this, and we can actually share information, and the systems can actually enhance kind of our understanding. Again, we take it very much for granted that we can interact with news systems online, and they automatically annotate the news that we're reading, and then we can look at a topic and go under there. And we can now get to a point where we can do the same thing with local languages. So we are still just at the beginning, and it's really something interesting to see where it's going to go over the next 2 or 3 years with all the collaborators.
And I'm just going to ask one more technical question. What is the challenge around GPUs that you're facing in Africa that we don't experience in the West? Could you just elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so this is a technical requirement that if you're training systems today, is you need graphical processing units. So these things that in the past we used to connect them to games and getting good visuals and all those things. But then to train very big deep learning models, you need GPU access on that part. And there are ways that we're trying to look at actually reducing this. So sure, I might have the resources to build servers for my research group at my university, but other people in different parts, even of South Africa or the African continent, there's very prohibitively expensive because you could be looking at even entry-level good ones for natural language processing being tens of thousands of dollars. But the arrival, I think, of cloud-based systems where we have a lot of support from people like Google Research, who are then giving us access to cloud infrastructure that we can then use, but then that requires that you have good internet. You can, as you say, now just imagine you have to deal with 20 to 30 gigs of speech data on there. Now the connectivity becomes the problem. But then through Masakhane, what we then notice is that people then look for innovative ways to still work through these and find ways to share data, share their resources. I make available our cloud infrastructure to other people on the African continent who are working in AI, who just need access to somebody like me who's a faculty member.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vukosi. It seems to me like there's an opportunity there for an African or African-American billionaire to step in rather than it being something that is simply owned or anticipated that Google will step in and become the law as you guys are all doing this really deep work and facilitating in ways that, quite frankly, people are not interested in right now because it isn't monetizable in this moment. So let's hope that we can find our way to those kinds of deep pockets that really are coming from the same perspective. So moving into more technical detail, our third speaker is Dr. Jackie Berry, who is a cognitive scientist, and she came on board with this project when she was a Fulbright scholar at the university in Egypt, which is when she first came on board with the great zeal that she will share with us today. So thank you, Jackie. Over to you.
Thank you so very much, Ama. You are definitely our fearless leader. I also want to extend a special thank you to Reinhard and to Ada and to Jinyu and all the folks at I2U who've done just a great job making this such a seamless process to be involved in the webinar series here. I'm a cognitive scientist, and cognitive psychology deals with the area of memory, it deals with the area of perception, it deals with the area of attention, and it deals with the area of language. And language is really what ties all of this together because it's what informs our human experience. Actually, before I move a little further, I do want to also thank my colleagues, Professor Jose and Vukosi, who have done such a great job teaching me more than I thought I would ever know about this topic. But getting back to language, so the reality is, as Jose said in his talk, AI, as much as it is artificial and as much as it is extremely capable and fast and has high capacity, it is still filtered through human concepts. And human concepts are filtered through the human experience, which is filtered through language, because language is oftentimes how we categorize things and how we form ideas in our mind, and it's how we approach things. So we can't really look at AI without looking at the human experience, and we can't really look at the human experience without looking at language. And language is key because some scholars even argue that that's actually what is part of what makes us human beings. So every creature on Earth is given one gift that will help them survive. Cheetahs, for example, can run really fast. Well, human beings, we're not particularly big and we're not particularly fast, but we have these massive brains that can help us solve problems and work together and teach our young. But the key to that is language, because that's what allows us to communicate and collaborate and pass down information and work together in not just concrete arenas, but in abstract arenas as well. So I'll just get right into my talk. If the slides, please. Okay, so let's talk about bilingualism, because the key to AI and understanding human concepts is language. And a lot of people, this is now becoming the norm more than anything. So as Vukosi was saying, he speaks multiple languages because that's how he was raised as a youth in South Africa. That's not necessarily the case where I live. I live in the United States, but it's becoming more so the case. So bilingualism is extremely prevalent in every country. In Europe, where people are very close together, they are encouraged to speak a lot of other languages. In the USA, at least 20% of people report speaking some language other than English at home. And Africa has 4 major languages and hundreds of minor languages. And Arabic is the second most common language with 260 million people speaking it. And I'll get into the specifics of Arabic later on. You'll see why I talk about that. But the reality is doctors used to advise people to not teach their children, if they could all help it, more than one language. Because when a child is learning 2 lexicons versus 1, they can mix the 2, they can confuse the 2, and building up the repository of vocabulary for 2 sets of words, for 2 separate stores of information can take more time. So the child will actually look as though they are developmentally behind relative to their monolingual peers. That's not necessarily the case, because on the other side of that is the ability to have different concepts in different languages. There are words in some languages that don't appear in other languages. And there are benefits to being bilingual, such as your brain forms multiple routes to get to different concepts, which actually protects you later on in life against problems such as dementia. So during normal conversation, people who are multilingual will often alternate between 2 or more languages that are understood by participants in the conversation. And this is what we refer to as code switching. So code switching, a lot of people who are bilingual do this. They will speak in one language. And I heard this one when I was in Egypt. They would just have a conversation. And then when it got to a point where they couldn't express what they were trying to express in that language, they would switch to the other language and they would say a few words, and maybe they would stay in that language for the rest of the sentence or the paragraph or even the rest of the conversation. And maybe they would switch back. But the point is, it's something that people do regularly, and researchers and linguists are arguing that until we take the process of code switching seriously, we can't really understand what's going on in the bilingual mind. Next slide, please. So there are certain advantages, as I said before. One of these is executive function. So if you are speaking in one language, you have to inhibit the other language. The brain is going to, because it takes a lot to generate a thought, translate that into actions, send that to the motor part of the brain, and then I'm simplifying the process, but then turn that into output called speech, and then form the correct mouth movements and control your breath and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's one or the other. So your brain is stopping one language from being activated while it is using the other language. Another advantage to being bilingual is attention. So if we look at processes such as visual search, and various other aspects of attention that we study in cognitive psychology, bilingual people can tune out irrelevant information much better than monolingual people. There's also something called task switching, which is costly. And I'll get into the idea of switching later on in my talk when I talk about switching between devices and interfaces, but just switching between basic tasks. And we all think we're multitasking and switching all the time. And we are, but you're not doing multiple tasks at a time. You're switching between the two very, very rapidly, and that's a direct cost. So when I switch from one task to another, there's a startup, there's a slowdown, meaning that the momentum is lost from the previous task, and it takes me time to get into the groove of doing the next task. So I do the next task immediately after a switch, a little bit slower than the previous task. But more importantly, there's also a global cost. And the global cost is that there's kind of like an overhead in managing multiple tasks. So if you just have one task that you're worried about, you can do that task really, really well, and you can just pound away at it as quickly as you can. But when you have two tasks, you're juggling. And the overhead of having these two separate task sets that may or may not have different response sets and different stimuli, don't want to get too technical here, but the point is even repeating a task when you have two takes longer than just having one task to worry about. So bilingual people tend to be extremely flexible. I'm using the term bilingual pretty copiously, but the reality is anyone who speaks multiple languages, like my colleague Vukosi. Some people speak 3, 4, 5, and 6 languages, and that is wonderful for them. Whether you speak multiple languages and are a polyglot, or whether you are bilingual, the reality is your mental flexibility is much better than your monolingual counterparts. There are some disadvantages in terms of speech production. It takes a little bit of that startup, and that's that startup, right? Which language am I speaking in? Which code am I using? And there's a brief dip in the consistency of the conversation while people switch from one code to the other. Another disadvantage is thinking about one's own cognitive performance. That's called metacognitive processing, as well as trying to discern speech if you are in a noisy environment. So people who are speaking just one language, they have a lot of practice at understanding, and a lot of speech comprehension is categorical perception. We won't get into the details of that right now, but you get really good at understanding the phonemes specific to your language when you practice just one language. So if you have an imperfect environment, let's say there's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of noise, you can better discern the speech in that environment than someone who's bilingual and is trying to discern speech from, let's say, another language. So production of speech can be slower and more prone to errors. And I would just like to add to that, with the masks that we are using with this COVID-19, I've noticed that definitely is a problem when people are trying to communicate. People are used to using the cues of looking at people's lips. And also the mask kind of filters out some of the more nuanced sounds. So that's another example. Wearing a mask, as we are required to today in a lot of places here in the United States, wearing a mask is an example of an imperfect listening environment. Next slide, please. So code switching and dysglossia. Dysglossia is when you have two or more varieties of a language in a particular speaking environment or in a community. So code switching is going back and forth. And when you have languages that, let's say, you use for more than one purpose, for example, that would be dysglossia. In Arabic, most Arabic countries use modern standard Arabic, which is also referred to as literary Arabic, for all formal communications, for all media, and for all for anything where they need to communicate cross country or cross dialect. But within their own countries, they actually tend to have, when I say they, I mean Arabic speaking countries for whom that's the dominant language, their own spoken Arabic, colloquial Arabic. So in Egypt, for example, they speak Amaya, that's the colloquial spoken form of Arabic. There's a different form spoken in Morocco, there's a different form spoken in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different versions of spoken Arabic, depending on the location where you are. However, all of these countries are unified in terms of the literary Arabic that they use for formal communications. So there's a separate verbal dialect and a separate written communication dialect. So the interesting thing about code switching is you can't necessarily witness all of the effects of what is happening when someone's code switching in a dysglossic situation. So if someone's searching for a word, or let's say someone has to get triggered into the correct context for what they should be, for what language they should be using. For example, a lot of my colleagues use English primarily for science and for academic type conversations. And so the trigger context for them there is, okay, I'm speaking about science, which is primarily done in English, and so that automatically triggers them that they should be using English. They might have a different trigger for using their native language that they speak. But the reality is things are happening under the surface that we can't see when people are code switching in multiple language environments. Next slide, please. So let's talk about dysglossia and technology. As I said before, Amaya is the language that Egyptian Arabic speakers use for colloquial verbal communication. But interestingly, when a lot of technology was developed and started coming to the fore in the 1990s, it was developed in an English-only environment. It was developed in such a way that it did not support Arabic script. So what needed to happen was Arabic script needed to be transliterated so that you could use English alphanumeric characters to represent Arabic script so that you could pronounce the words and understand how to pronounce them visually by looking at them. So here's an example right here. So spoken code switching, an Egyptian person who is, let's say, on a campus where both Arabic and English are spoken, they might code switch between the two verbally, between Amaya and between English. But then when they code switch in a written dysglossic situation, they're writing English, they're writing modern standard Arabic, and they're writing something called Arabese. Arabese is also what the young people call Franco. It's also called Romanized. Arabese stands for Arabic and Inglesi, and when you mash those two together, you get this way to communicate, which again was originally developed because there was a lack of support for Arabic script using mobile technology. So this is a meta issue. Now let's just look at the conversation we have to the right of this slide. This is just a standard conversation between two people trying to figure out how they were going to have their weekend. And what the way the characters work is numbers are used to replace those sounds that don't exist in English. And for the letters that do correspond directly to Arabic script, those are simply used. So I'll just do my best to translate this particular conversation here. Hello, how are you? And then the other person says, hi, Tamem. Tamem means okay. Alhamdulillah, thank God. How are you? And you see they have an H here for Alhamdulillah. And then they switch to the other one and the person uses the 7 instead of the H. The H is representative of a particular sound that we don't have in English. What are you doing? I think that's how are you doing? And the 3 represents a sound that we don't have in English, which is ein. And then you can see there's multiple code switching going back and forth through the rest of this conversation while they're trying to plan what they're going to do for the rest of the weekend. So not only is there code switching between English and Arabic, but there's also this written code that was developed to work around technology not supporting Arabic script. And so this is an example of just echoing what my colleague Vukosi said in terms of teaching someone a language during the colonial process. It was originally in service of communicating with people who were local. In this situation, and I think it's kind of brilliant actually, this is actually in service of communicating with one another and being able to work around the fact that you don't have your native language supported. And the beauty of it is it's still continuing. So the keyboard that I use today, the mobile phone that I use today, they all have Arabic script. I used it when I was in Egypt. But at the end of the day, the young people and most of my college students that I dealt with would use this format to communicate in all of their text messaging. So I think it's brilliant. So cognitive code switching is a meta issue that informs how any technology used for AI, all the way from the interfaces to the data sets are interpreted and used. I also study TET-lag. That's what I was in Egypt to study, which is the brief performance dip caused by switching between two well-learned interfaces to complete the same or similar tasks. So just to give you a bit of background on that, next slide, please. Okay, so TET-lag is a slowdown. So we talk about task switching. There is a brief local cost when you start up a new task after switching over from an old task. We're talking a few hundred milliseconds, but of course this adds up over time. TET-lag is you're actually doing the same task. You're not switching tasks, but you are switching the mode in which you're doing that task. So for example, if I were to try to dial a telephone number on my cell phone, the keypad would be differently laid out than if I were to try to withdraw money from an ATM machine, or if I were to try to use a calculator, for example. This also affects things like piloting when controls are located in different directions and you are temporarily flummoxed when you're trying to switch which one you're dealing with. Surgeons who perform laparoscopic surgery have to often use the mirror image of the camera that is inside the patient's body. So they're actually performing the surgery upside down. And according to some research, all of the devices that we have, as many as 3.2 per person, we switch as much as 20 times per hour. That's just an incredible amount of switching. And it doesn't even include all of the switching that we do between applications and programs. I could pick up my phone and I might be on my phone for 1 hour, but I could switch between WhatsApp. I could switch between Facebook. I could switch between the texting app. I could switch between Gmail and so on and so forth. So we're constantly switching between ways of completing the same tasks, such as writing an email. And then of course there is QWERTY versus Dvorak keyboards. Some people are very wedded to the keyboard that they like, the one that's their preference, and trying to switch back to a different version of a keyboard. Again, this is the same task. They're still typing, but trying to switch to the different interface of the other keyboard can cause a problem. So this is all TET-lag. So TET-lag is basically the physical embodiment of code switching, where there's a verbal kind of startup costs when you're trying to produce language as a bilingual person, and you might be a little bit slower. I apologize, I don't have actual numbers on that, but just might be a little bit slower at producing speeches. The same thing with TET-lag. When you're interacting with a different interface, you're going to be a little bit slower when you're switching to that next interface. So it's the physical embodiment of code switching. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to wrap up my part of this conversation, and I'm really excited to get into some of the Q&A. The purpose of this part of the talk is really trying to get into how language ties everything together. Not only does language govern how we interact with one another and govern how we interact with our environments, because we use it to collaborate, to live in this world and to do things like build houses and build cars, but it also acts as a mediator for how we interact with technology. So language is the framework for how we do everything from type text messages to determine how we label every interaction that we have. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, so I'm just going to go into the natural language processing and machine learning applications. One of the things that we can do is we can computationally model interface switching. And this is such a very new topic. 10 years ago, it didn't matter because everyone didn't have a device that they were switching between writing emails on, sending text messages on, and calling home, and so on and so forth. So with computational modeling, we can actually look at some of that. So there's evidence for retroactive interference and for facilitation. We also need to account for dysglossic speech. So as I said, I've overheard so many conversations where people would be speaking one language, and because they didn't have the proper concept in their native language or in some other language, they had to switch to the other language. They had to code switch mid-conversation. Speech recognition should account for that because people are constantly doing it, particularly in professional environments. Computational modeling of how bilingualism affects interacting with technology. So if you have two separate frameworks for how you are conceptualizing the world, because again, language is how we're conceptualizing the world. This is what gives us the categories. This is what informs our interactions. Then how does that affect how you are interacting with the technology in front of you? And also a discovery of trigger context. So as I said before, when I interact with my colleagues in a scientific and academic context, they usually are already primed, so to speak, to be speaking English because that's the language that they use primarily. What context is going to trigger them to switch back to their native language? So that is the end of my portion, and I want to thank everyone so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to the question and answers, and I'm going to pass it back to Amma.
And thank you, Jackie. Just so fascinating. Every time we take a deep dive, I'm just calculating more and understanding more. And the last time we spoke, we actually did enter into a new space when I talked about the fact that using these interfaces, these different interfaces, we're actually using our bodies, and we're having to use our bodies in new and different ways. And this makes me think about the point in time where we will not have physical devices, where technology will be embedded into the environment in a whole different set of ways, or the possibility of that. So the idea of learning and learning with embodied cognition, I would think, would be an interesting area to further your research. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it would be an interesting area. And you're right, we're going to get to a point, particularly, I think, with wearable technology, where it's just the bodies interacting with the technology. But one thing that I think that's important is, again, language informs so much how we structure the technology, that we have to make sure that we have fair and uncolonialized ways of informing the AI, because the AI is going to inform us. And so we can't lose any of the languages that we have. I also want to say that when you look at some things like African dance, and you look at different movement patterns, you're a dancer, Amma, so you can appreciate this. When I look at some of the traditional dances from cultures all over the world and some of the similarities that they have with one another and some of the differences, I think that's another way to translate culture into an artificial intelligence context.
Absolutely. I think there's so much to be extended there, and ways for us to be thinking about the future actually of the languages that are being generated to what we're doing now, power the devices, but movement encoding, working with language. There's a part of the brain called the Broca's area of the brain that's both responsible for creative movement and language, and interacting through a articulate body. And what does that articulate body look like? And this is a space that, again, using other modalities, that we can imagine that the technology can be in a completely other space than it currently is now. So
yes. Yeah, I was going to say with Broca's area, that is actually a source for one form of aphasia that you find when people have difficulty speaking. And what I would actually be interested in finding out, maybe you would know more about this, Amma, is whether or not there's a connection between the ability to express oneself via movement and any type of impairment in Broca's area.
Yeah, that would be absolutely fascinating research. And ultimately, again, different cultures have different ways of moving. and being informed by that. What's the impairment? How does that impact people from different cultures in terms of communication skills? So at this point, I want to bring all of the speakers back to the foreground so that we can address some of the interlinkages and the weaving and how we are really envisaging the movement forwards with this concept of Cosmo-Ubuntu and addressing some of the questions that have been coming through in our chat. So I see that there are many questions that have been answered already. And there was a question about how many people, this is a Vukosi question, if you're there, how many people in, say, Kenya or South Africa have access to computers to be able to make it possible that this translation is actually reaching the people? So I don't know if you have any data on that.
I don't have any numbers as per se, but I think I think I'll try to answer another question by typing it in. I mean, the answer, but we should think about further than just thinking about a person having a computer, a laptop, or a desktop. That a lot of interactions now with AI and machine learning systems are literally happening in multiple ways in the background. So whether you're using a phone and you're accessing a system, you make a query on a search engine, your expectation is that it's going to give you a response. And now the question is how instead of it just being, oh, it's translated into English first, and then there's a query, there might be something lost in translation, connecting to the machine. So building these systems and saying that they can actually work in local languages also allows them to capture nuances that are much more localized. And it might just be, sure, you interacting with through things like WhatsApp with a bot, and then that chat bot actually responding to you in a local language in a way. So it doesn't, I think we should move beyond a desktop or a laptop. That's kind of now out of the window. We have computers in our pockets. And now, because of that as well, there is a risk that even more people are being left behind just because they're not being catered to with their computer in their pockets.
Thank you. A question for Dr. Berry. Could you explain the categorization of languages in Africa as major and minor, and which are the 4 major languages? Also, since AI is basically premised on code switching and code identification, how do we harmonize the intelligent processes to simulcast languages without categorizing them and therefore creating a focal bias? So how do we avoid the stacking up of languages if we're actually thinking Ubuntu? How do we avoid that without passing through the node of English?
Thank you very much. I think that's a fantastic question. So to answer the first one, I believe the 4 major languages are French, English, Portuguese, and Arabic. And then there are a lot of minor languages, hundreds. And I think Vukosi could probably speak to that because he speaks a lot about the local languages in his area. As far as how to switch from one, that is the idea of a node, right? So the idea of a language node, and you know, we get into this a lot when we look at priming and some of the issues related around language. Perhaps that is not something that we want to do. So in other words, there are some concepts that are going to be represented in some languages that are not represented in other languages. And there are simply not going to be a direct translation. So the idea of filtering it through an English node, that's absolutely right. We don't want to filter it through an English node, right? We want it to stand as a concept in and of itself without having that mediating point through which we proceed. Now, sometimes obviously that's necessary. If you use English to conduct your science and your academic work, then you might need to translate it into that way. But, you know, as much as possible, I think we should be striving for having the language stand on its own merit. And if there are concepts that it's conveying that simply don't exist in another language, then so be it, and work around the translation for it.
Great. And I would also, I'm coming to you, Jose, I would also add that this is an opportunity for language research, because there are people that were called Jalis, the storytellers, the people that traditionally carried history and concepts that are quote unquote ancient, but talk about technologies that we don't yet know about. There was a civilization called Egypt and other parts of Africa where we still don't understand how those structures were built. There were technologies that we don't yet have a hold on. So there's some unearthing and some creativity. I think that the people that have deep, traditional, if you will, indigenous knowledge can be tapped into. And this again is opening that circle beyond that which we know in the academic space. Jose, I'm going to hand over to you, and then Vukosi.
Yes, and I want to add to to this conversation on language that Jackie's point about the nodes. There's also another component of it, and part of what Masakhane is doing too. But is the component of language. When we think about major and minor, that's dichotomizing. That's exactly the Cartesian stuff we're trying to challenge here. And also, we don't categorize. We shouldn't be categorizing languages in that way, because when you think, for instance, in Mozambique, we say we are Portuguese-speaking people, right? Portuguese is the language that's if you think about majority language, be like Portuguese, that's a major language, right? Because that's what the government adopted as the only official language after independence. Now, what I know, even conversing with my own friends, I know that we don't speak Portuguese well. We struggle with the language. So we know the code language, the colonial code language, but we don't think in that way. So, to say that that's the majority language, the French, the English and whatever, that's a problem, because, and it is what literature tells us, and Jackie's totally accurate. This is what we're going to see when we type what is a majority language. But Africans actually speak their native language more. So but those are not tabulated. They're not, categorized in the same way, because we're very fluid in our speaking language. What we see in the literature, because linguistics is also colonial, discipline, like many other disciplines are, is the language code. So I don't think in Portuguese most of the times. So I have to, cognitively, I do speak, I have Shangan in the background and Xizhong in the background of my language, and I have to translate that into this other code. So yes, this is an argument. We need to get deeper into this issue of language, because it is a very colonial statement to say Lusophone, Francophone, and all those things, because it continues to be taking up the space of Africa and categorizing it in the way that the colonial powers wanted us to categorize. So yes, anyway, so we can, there's many languages that are much widely spoken in Africa that need to become those. And we don't even, the fact is we don't care which one is the majority, and we shouldn't care which one is the majority or minority. They are languages for communication, for human communication. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Vukosi, do you have anything to add to that?
I think there's been also some questions on like what happens with having another language like English as being the in-between point where you go from one language to another. You have to pass through English or pass through French or pass through Portuguese or whatever. But that's not necessarily like going to be for the medium to long term. What's happening right now in terms of the infrastructure that is being built up in the deep learning space or natural language processing is we're building these multilingual models. So with multilingual models, connecting to what Jose was saying, you can now say, we know that the languages in the Southern African area developed next to each other and with each other. Now, how can we exploit that knowledge? How can we now build systems that can do translation, that can do annotation, that can do like entity recognition, even question answering for Sepedi, but with Xitsonga in there, like, you know, with a lot of, like, you know, other Sepedi, I mean, Tswana, Sesotho, all those things can be built into this one model, but then that interaction at the end of the day is just Sepedi to Sepedi or something like that. That is the thing that's currently where we're pushing, because even with such kind of adjustments, it then doesn't require that the one language has a major resources. It's now when you put all these small pieces together that you now come up with a representation that is richer in the core, and then can be used across these languages. And it's not necessarily going to be something that's Anglophone or like, you know, Francophone. It will actually now be very much localized.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a question for Jose. Can you speak on the possible concerns from the Cosmo-Ubuntu philosophy subduing any gains from singular individual creativity and innovation?
May you repeat that question again?
Yeah. Can you speak on the possible concerns around the Cosmo-Ubuntu philosophy being subdued by the concerns of humanism? Do you see any potential conflict there?
Yes, I mean, so when we actually, you know, there's a whole an article I wrote that I'm hoping one day it's going to come out and all that, but to differentiate the, you know, humanism and Ubuntu because of that particular concern. And we've had leaders, including, you know, Kenneth Cohen and others, who have used the word humanism in the context of Africa, that, you know, what Africans do is humanist, you know, and so Cosmo-Ubuntu could very easily be absorbed by some of these forces, you know, that claim some sort of co-opting of these concepts, just like Ubuntu has been also co-opted before, you know, to think, oh, this is the same as humanism, you know, we are being humanistic, you know, you know, there's now there are humane actions. I do make this very clear in my argument that there are humane actions in the humanistic framework. There's no question about it. That's why we have the UN. We have, you know, all these different organizations that are looking at humane questions, and we have, you know, humanitarian organizations and so on. And we also have the Declaration of Human Rights. But if you read all of that stuff is all embedded in a very, very modernistic understanding of the human. You know, if you carefully read this stuff. So it could, many people would look at it and say, oh, no, it's the same as Ubuntu, you know, it's all about community, it's all about solidarity. And so there is that danger. And I'm very aware of that. And I'm hoping that we become more nuanced in the way we use language, the way we understand even our, you know, humanity and express that humanity. And I will, you know, give you a quick example. When I was in South Africa once, and I spoke to somebody who was a Venda speaking person, but she spoke Shangaan too. And so I said to her, and Hukosi will relate to this, I said to her, she said to me, oh, we came to your house to visit you yesterday in Shangaan. And I said to her, you and whom? Because in Shangaan too. So we spoke Shangaan, but two different cognitions right there. Because of the Portuguese colonialism in my, you know, that took over my cognition of even language, we in Mozambique began to shape our language differently. So in Shangaan, the Shangaan that I spoke, there was an individual. And in her Shangaan, that individual could not exist without ancestors, without everyone around them. So it has to be plural. You know, so we had a little dissonance right there. And so we have to look at these nuances, even in the articulation of Ubuntu, you know, oh, this is humane, this is cool, you know, collective, you know, how everything African is thrown into the collective, you know, therefore we all, you know, so anyway, but these are very embedded, you know,
yes. And so
address.
And so this notion of the technology speeding us up, part of what we have to do is actually slow down. And we have to do some deep analysis to see where our own languages have been co-opted to mean something else. And that's some very dedicated work. We've had some wonderful questions here. We're not going to be able to respond to all of this because we took time with our presentation to really enable the information to land with you. We hope that we will be able to continue the dialogue. I've just placed in the chat window another link to a place where you can sign up to be on our newsletter or even join in our circle. We're constantly extending. And I just see the other presenters have just left me on my own. I'm feeling very alone, not very Ubuntu right now. But that's to say, you're all in the background. I know you're there. Greatest thanks to Femi Omeri, the Right Honourable, who's been responding to questions along with Tawanda Chabikwa. I'd also like to say that the artwork that you saw behind Jackie Berry during her presentation was the work of Nana Opoku. He is our artist, or one of our artists, a visual artist that's really embedded in the digital space. And were we at the conference in the physical sense, you would have seen his work exhibited. We are many artists, as you have heard, and we are many thinkers. And I'm thankful that many of you are here. Kishore Rogers, we're entrepreneurs. Fumi Awira, a professor of law. And we are many in many different places. So please do share your information with us, and we will collate all of the questions and we will dedicate ourselves to responding. If you have any other new ideas about partnerships, we are here, and we're looking forward to a further presentation with ITU, with AI for Good in the fall. I hope that we will be able to connect with you further on our other panels that we have been preparing. But it's been such a laborious space, and I'm thanking you all again for really working with us as we have developed this process. So thank you, and have a wonderful evening. Good morning to those of you in California that are having coffee, and have a nice lunch, those of you on the East Coast, and those of you in Kenya, have a wonderful evening. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Ama, Vukosi, Jose, Jackie, Tawanda, and Femi, and everybody involved. It was a really excellent discussion. I think there was a lot going on in the chat and the Q&A, and I think a lot was learned and very enriching. Also, I'd like to thank all of the participants for making it so engaging, for asking all these great questions and wanting to learn more and contribute your own insights. But now, before we wrap up, I would like to highlight a few things that may be of interest to you in the AI for Good program. Tomorrow, the 16th of July at 5:30 p.m. Geneva time is the launch of the Global Data Pledge with the X Prize Foundation. And then next week on Thursday and Friday, we will have the latest installments of the Global Dialogue on Esports, as well as the next Innovation Factory pitching session. We are posting the links to these events in the chat, and you can always find out more on our website at aiforgood.itu.int. And with that, we have come to the end of this webinar and would like to once again thank everybody involved, the panelists, participants, our partners, sponsors, and our co-convener, Switzerland. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you tomorrow.